The entrepreneurial journey is rarely straightforward. It's unpredictable,
Challenging.
Collaborative.
Risky,
Transformative.
and often deeply personal.
the VentureWell Voices podcast offers an inside look at the changemakers using science and technology to solve the world's greatest challenges. Hear their stories of the messy, meaningful path from idea to impact.
All right. So welcome back to VentureWell Voices. My name is Christina Tamer, and today I'm joined by the co-founder and CEO of AeroShield Materials, Elise Strobach. Welcome, Elise.
Christina, very excited to be here.
Happy to have you. So I want to invite our listeners to imagine or recall a time where they're in maybe an older home in a colder climate. I'm in Massachusetts. I know, Elise, you grew up in Wisconsin, so lots of harsh winters. And those older single, maybe double pane windows, you can sometimes feel the draft, feel the breeze coming in through them. You just know that your heat is going out through that window and you're losing some energy. And on a larger scale, it accounts for about 30% of our home heating and cooling energy use in the US. And in addition to that, it's uncomfortable. There are triple pane windows, but they're big, bulky, expensive, and there are some older coatings on the market. But for the most part, the technology hasn't advanced in the last 50 years until AeroShield came along. So AeroShield has developed a transparent aerogel, and when added to a double pane window, it can boost the thermal efficiency by up to 65%. It outperforms the triple pane windows and is thinner and lighter. So a win overall, and you're nice and warm. So Elise, how did I do on describing the problem, and what's your connection to this problem? Why did you want to solve it?
Yeah, no, you did a fantastic job. And I love that, we get to work on a problem at AeroShield that people can feel and they experience every day, whether, hot climate, cold climate, you just want to be comfortable inside. For me, this connection to how I came to be in this position at AeroShield working on this problem actually started for me with a passion for, really trying to find an understanding of fundamental, like things like heat and mass transfer, and think about how we can apply them to problems to make our homes and lives, more comfortable, more affordable, just better. And for me, I think in particular, was really excited about the idea that, we can apply this fundamental understanding of science in a way that helps us live a little bit more harmoniously with nature. So originally, I actually started by being really interested in renewable energy. And as I decided to go to undergrad to become a mechanical engineer, I think, during that education, really started to get an understanding that, energy is not just about making energy and having lots of it, but also how we use it. And so that was where I think sort of two things came about where, this understanding that the problems that we have, like having enough energy to keep our homes really comfortable, that it's not just about making lots of energy, but it's also thinking about how we use it. And that also that the scope of these problems are huge, that it's not just as simple as saying, oh, I'm going to go into the lab and I'm going to make a device and then it's going to be great and everybody's just going to want it. It's going to change the world tomorrow. It's really this concept of to start at the fundamentals meant that, when I got to the end of my undergrad, I realized that I can just barely start to understand why these problems exist in the world. And I can, just start to see that there are solutions that we could be developing, but how you actually take those solutions and apply them in a way that people can access them, where that problem is also your solution. It can be delivered to solve that problem in a way that is effective when you look at that holistic view of not just taking that fundamental understanding, applying it or making a device, but then actually making sure that the person who uses or is having that problem solved is aware and can make that choice to have a better technology. So for me, that actually started by the journey to AeroShield and focusing on windows and this aerogel, this transparent insulating material, actually started by, as I got done with undergrad, really thought that I was going to be, renewable energy on the generation side. And so joined a research group called the Device Research Lab and in mechanical engineering at MIT to work on a solar energy harvesting project that was using this really exotic material, an aerogel, which is basically a super nanoporous glass, which enables the material to be super insulating, incredibly lightweight. More than 95% of this material is air trapped inside of pores that are small, nanometer size. So orders of magnitude smaller than even the wavelengths of visible light. So a really exotic, and it has a lot of unexpected properties. And at the time we were looking at trying to optimize it for the solar thermal device, thinking about, hey, if we could have this, if we could harvest that sun's energy, put it into thermal, we can store it, we can convert it into whatever form we need. But in order to make that device efficient and cost effective, we need to be able to collect the sun's light and trap it and then use it. And so that was where I joined this group with a lot of really talented scientists looking to design, build, and actually test a device like this out in the field. And so we physically had to learn how to make these aerogel materials that were invented by NASA almost 100 years ago, but we were making them at the lab in these really small sizes. And so as we started to, me specifically getting into this project and trying to understand how do we optimize this material for the solar device meant that I had to get this fundamental understanding of not only the aerogel material, but also the thermal properties of how this whole device and how that aerogel would impact it. And then as that project advanced, as we got better and better at making the aerogel, it then started to become the question of, okay, but then if all these pieces in the device come together and this technology, this whole device to collect solar energy were out in the market, would people actually use it? Would it be cost effective? Is there enough physical materials in the world to make enough of these to actually make a difference? And that at the same time happened as we had a bit of an accident in the lab with this aerogel recipe that we were making. And long story short, we were trying different variations of recipes. We just sort of read one of the ingredients wrong. So we just put more of a catalyst in than we normally did. And what we got out was something that just looked very different. Really transparent, as these small samples that were just sitting out, and we sort of looked at each other as it came out of the production process, and we said, this looks very different. Oops, I bet you this doesn't have any of the properties that we need to make this solar device work. And as we tested it, we found that it actually had all of the properties that we needed thermally. It was still just as insulating as the other forms of this aerogel that we'd been making, that others had been making for decades now. But the real difference was that was very, very clear and even more transparent than glass. Yeah. And so as I was doing this,
like a eureka moment.
Yeah. And it was a little bit of like the, oops, do we throw this out? Let's test it first. Glad we did. And so from there, it was a little bit of the iteration of first trying to look at, hey, we've got this new set of properties. Is that useful for this solar thermal device? And the pretty quick answer was, it does make it a little bit better, but not enough that this fundamental innovation in a combination of something that really is ultra clear. And
so how did you discover the Windows application then?
Yeah, so we were continuing to share updates. We were actually, the Solar Thermal Project was funded by ARPA-E, so the Advanced Research Project Agency for Energy. And in particular, there's a couple of milestones within that grant that require us, as we're doing the fundamental research, to say, okay, why should we keep funding this? How is this going to get out into the world, in the US in particular, and help us advance, needs that are core to American citizens? And so that is things like, can we make materials that give us energy and help us save energy in the US? And can we do that cost effectively? And so as we were looking at this material and doing some of this research on solar thermal, going out into the world and saying, okay, now if we could do this solar thermal energy harvesting better, would that solve this problem? We're getting very mediocre answers that were a lot of pieces around, there's actually logistical challenges to solar thermal energy harvesting. Where are you going to put these fields? You're going to put them in a place where maybe the energy isn't being used. And so some of our program, managers sort of said, we've seen this happen many times before. We think that this is a really important part in the project. It's required by some of your grant requirements, that you go out and look at other applications than the one that we funded you to explore. And so I had some prior experience working at Johnson Controls in a building efficiency group. So reached out to my former supervisor there, and he jumped on a call, and I basically, didn't give him all the fundamentals, just sort of said, we're working on this cool material for solar thermal. Now we found a way to make it really transparent. Just want to understand if this is something that we should look at for the window market. And almost his immediate reaction was like, yes, we need better, transparent insulating materials. And that was enough that, when I brought that results back to my research group, my advisor, as well as these program directors, that was sort of the trigger for them saying, we agree. We look at a lot of different technical areas. We agree that you should look at this window application more. And that was sort of, for me, came right at the transition between master's and PhD. It was ultimately actually one of the things where I came back to my advisor and said, I think solar thermal is great, but I want to stay for my PhD to work on windows and explore this and take this groundwork that we have with the aerogel and figure out if this solution would be better for windows, while some of my colleagues in the lab still were working on solar thermal in parallel. So a little bit of divide and conquer.
Yeah, that's great. ARPA-E was really supportive and instrumental in this sort of journey for you. And then let's jump ahead a few years. You pursued your PhD. I think we met at that point. When did you then take the leap into founding a company and really leaning into entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so I would say that it's easy to look back on it now and go, oh, it's so obvious. And, all these pieces in the story that, just like you made this material and then you found where it'd be applied and then you decided to start a company and then you made the company and now we're making prototypes.
There's a lot more pain and suffering that happened in that time, I'm sure. Yeah.
And a lot of time, to be honest with you. A lot of, like, for me, it was, hearing this positive reinforcement from ARPA-E and, from my former supervisor who had the specialty in building efficiency. And that was enough of we'll say a poke to get out into the world, get out of the building and go talk to people that work with windows, that work with buildings, that work with all kinds of transparent materials that also have insulating properties, and learn from them. And so I would say that then sort of started an arc where then I also started to take courses starting with MIT. And then eventually, found other resources like VentureWell that, as the vision of what the company around this technology needed to look like to be able to deliver this solution into the market to create impact, started with some fundamental courses where I didn't even bring this aerogel material in. I actually worked on somebody else's technology because I went separate from me studying and working on this all the time. I just want to see if I can understand entrepreneurship and what it takes to build a business around. And I think a little bit of what happened when I look back on it now was I did that again and then took a different course where we actually formed a group and worked together. And I just continued to have success, whether it was talking with the market, talking with grant funders, talking with people who wanted to join and work on the project, even, donating their time. And I think all of those were signals that, one, welcomed all that input and that help. So it made a more robust and I think there were a lot of things that other people could give advice on and say, I've seen this happen. This isn't going to work. You should at least consider trying something different. And so I think a lot of that, this vision of what AeroShield was by the time we came to 2019, we had started to go through the VentureWell programs. We had started to win some early tech to market transfer grants, some early commercialization grants, both from federal government, from the state, and from some really great entrepreneurial clean tech entities. And I think, there came this point where, no matter how I presented the technology and its ability to solve these problems in the window market, and all of the different ways that we could build AeroShield up around to deliver that solution, I think there were, no matter what, we kept coming back around to people really liked the idea. They wanted to help with it. They believed on its very core, the fundamental breakthrough we had, why nobody had done it before. Those things all resonated. And I continued to hear this positive feedback of not only, hey, this could be a great company. The world needs this solution. But there also started to emerge this thread of nobody else is going to care or understand at this moment to form this company and bring it out of the lab as much as you, Elise, being this PhD student that has worked on it.
Yes, yeah. And
so I think that, combined with having won the MIT Clean Energy Prize, which is now the Climate and Energy Prize, was really, we've got capital now. We can actually start forming this business and spinning out. So I would say that the moment that we actually signed those incorporation papers and got that started was the moment where it was, oh my gosh, up until then, it was almost like looking at the data and going, well, of course, this is what the data tells us we should do. We should go get more, support and letters of support from the industry. And then we should go apply for these grants that would help us do research to translate this out of the lab. And then before you knew it, there was almost like, look at all this momentum. how could we say no to this opportunity to have a small chance to change the world? Yeah,
That's amazing. And when did you incorporate? Was it around 2019?
yeah, the fall of 2019.
Great. So I think a great way of illustrating that is when we met around that time, you were talking about 11-inch samples, like pretty small samples, and then maybe you had plans to get to 12 by 24-inch sheets. So can you tell me about where you are now? Because I think you're a lot bigger now.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So one of the aspects of how you make an aerogel is it does require a manufacturing step that basically you can think about it like a high pressure, medium temperature vessel.
Hmm.
And those we don't have big vessels just lying around in the university. And so, up until 2019, early 2020, I was still primarily working on my PhD. That point in time was focused on grants that were, for example, like from the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, explicitly looking at trying to translate these technologies out of the lab. Um, and in particular, like was trying to pretty much we had answered all of the other fundamental questions of, from what we know today, could this be cost effective? Would it have performance? Are there enough ways to integrate this material into the existing way that we make windows today so that we could at least get started before maybe we even think about how an aerogel could revolutionize the way we think about windows? We just want to prove that this material can get out there and do what we said first. And so, one of the things that we did is we were making samples this big. We had gotten them up to about 6 inches. And one
Okay.
of these questions was still, do your models at these small scales,
Yeah.
does that work at large scale?
Yeah.
So before we could spin out of the university, so in 2020, then AeroShield formed, we ended up buying a used vessel from
Hmm.
somebody else who was using it for a little bit different of an application.
Hmm.
And we started to be able to make 14-inch by 20-inch. And that was, the biggest transparent aerogel that we'd certainly made to date. Before then, we'd actually just cut out these small samples and tiled them together. And I can
Yeah.
tell you that it takes 46-inch discs to be able to cut off enough hexagons to make a 1 foot by 1 foot aerogel. And so by the time that we got to this, buying this first vessel, we actually sized it just so that it could make the industry standard test size sheets. We knew that being able to make bigger than that would have definitely convinced people earlier that we could
Hmm.
scale and that it would be cost effective. But to take on all that risk all at once,
Yeah.
we needed to be able to do this industry standard testing to be able to engage with customers in a meaningful way. And we
Hmm.
knew that if we then could get customers to engage in a meaningful way, we could raise more capital, or we could work
Hmm.
with them to get the resources that we need to physically scale up to even larger sizes. So that real first battle of getting out of the lab was just to be able to look at the industry and say, okay, what's the minimum size that if we could
Yeah.
prove this, it would give a step change to your confidence that we can solve this problem. And so that was
And they would
really
take your call and take you a little bit more seriously, right?
absolutely. And I could say even now, because I also mentioned that we spun out, end of
Yeah.
2019, beginning of 2020. So we also had a little bit of this, hitting the COVID of
Yes.
that whole first year in 2020, we used it to make these industry standard test samples. And so for us, it was such a step change when we started to be able to go visit people in person that we could
Hmm.
have this little portable sample that we could
Hmm.
carry around, and we could have small samples of the material that people could play with and go, this is like nothing I've ever felt or touched before. I believe that this is a nanomaterial unlike anything I've seen.
Yeah.
But then to show them a window and have them go, I don't see what you've put in here that's different. And that was something that when we were in the lab for the 6 years of my PhD, that we tried to convince people in the market, big window companies, other grant funders. We kept saying, like, no, this is the clearest aerogel. Like,
Yeah.
and they said, well, you can make it clear at small sizes, but we just don't think that you're going to be able to scale that up. Or if you can, it won't be cost effective. And so that was why these industry standard test sizes, it got us into this mode where we could interact directly with customers. And then
Yeah.
it meant that the funders, whether it's investors or grants, they started to listen to the customers because the
Hmm.
customers have known about aerogels for many, many years. And so when we showed them a sample and they said, I can't see it, that was a pivotal moment. And it brought a lot of different people to the table and gave us a lot of different options for how to get more resources to help us grow beyond that phase.
Yeah. Yeah. It was kind of like you have to not see it to believe it almost.
Yes.
So Yeah, it's a to your advantage that you were able to, bring this because it's that word clear or transparent, people can say, sure, yeah, it's probably mostly transparent or mostly clear, but it actually is at the scale required. And, you had to face this doubt of, sure, you can do it at a small scale, but replicating this for our needs for a large window is a different hurdle to clear. So you mentioned earlier, the system of energy and energy efficiency. There's also the complex value chain of the whole Windows industry, what I described at the beginning around a person in a home versus the decision makers on the materials for a window. Can you share how you took your systems thinking approach and use that to understand the whole value chain of the Windows industry to get to those decision makers?
Yeah, and I think that's such a great question. And I'd also just want to call out that, the VentureWell support was, I think, something that really helped change my thinking from, we've got this technology, it's ready to go, it can solve the problem. Like the technology can just solve the problem, like it just get it out into the world. And then I think, one of the things that VentureWell helped us really do was take a holistic look at, it's not just about the technology, but it's what you're building around it to deliver that solution. And, one of the pieces that I found interesting and a little bit frustrating, especially in the beginning, was how, the window industry has been an established technology running a lot of processes that even if you rewind 75 years ago, they really don't look a lot different than the way that we make windows today. And there've been a lot of technical advancements and a lot of, better performance and taking technologies like low E coatings or the way that we make double panes and making them better or making them cheaper or offering them in more ways that everybody can access them and have more windows in their home. But a true breakthrough, fundamental different technology hasn't really penetrated the window market yet. And so that was one of the things that as we started to look at why that was true, that was where we started to see this complex system and stakeholder chain. And this idea that you have to, if this is the stakeholder chain that you're trying to either disrupt or work with to get this technology delivered, that you have to understand the motivations. And for me, that's that word value proposition. Like we want them to change their behavior. We want them to take this technology and either add it to something they're doing today or replace something alternative with it. And so we need to understand it's not just about this, amazing technology that, oh, if only they could understand it, they'd love it. It's actually, we had to learn about how they were doing things today and why the way that they were doing things today had to exist. And one of the nuances that I just found super interesting is, most of the windows, more than 90% of what we make today in new windows in the US is this double pane. So two panes of glass with an air gap that's sealed. And I didn't realize until we got in, toured those facilities, saw how they were made, and then visited these different manufacturing, spaces all over the country that things like shipping over the Rockies, you can't do that once you've sealed a window. So that means even if I wanted to make all the windows in one big consolidated manufacturing in the central of America, like I couldn't ship it over the mountains no matter what. So somehow, this double pane solution has to have some level of distributed manufacturing.
Yeah.
And that was something that, from an aerogel perspective, never thought about those logistics, never thought about why these window makers or glass makers were located or positioned where they were for supply chains. And as, just started to get curious, I think that just led to me asking more questions. And I think if I'd have gone in, explicitly saying, my job here is only to ask the questions that I think validate or invalidate what I believe is true about AeroShield's technology and how it can solve their problems.
Yeah.
I don't think that I would have started to understand that each stakeholder is motivated a little bit differently. It's like your glass maker who might make just the glass, but might make and coat the glass with a special coating to help insulate your window. They might sell, but they also might make their own insulated glass unit. That might be sold to one of the big window brands that we know in our homes. That also might be delivered to a window brand that you don't know, right? That might be doing something a little bit different and more exotic. But that glass pane could be made from the same upstream supplier. It's just starting to say, well, if we want to come in and disrupt that, and there are a lot of different people with a lot of different needs, and that doesn't even consider, us as homeowners who ultimately get to make that decision of, do I want a new window or not, and which one if I do. And so from that standpoint, I think it was, initially a little bit of oh, we'll do a couple interviews and we'll understand this market and we'll know how to deliver the solution. And I think one of the happiest places I've been to be proven wrong is that there's just a lot of nuance and that there's a lot to just be curious about.
Yeah.
And as we got more curious, we started to hear things from these different stakeholders that, if you think about somebody who's making glass and then selling it to somebody who coats, who's sealing it into a unit, who's selling it to somebody else who puts it into a window, who sells it to somebody else who makes sure it gets installed in your home, so that you, the person who actually writes that check and pays for the window and then deals with it in your home, that while the people that make the glass do the research and they understand, what the homeowner wants because that's important to them, understanding is different, and they're motivated to understand that homeowner differently than anybody else in that value chain. And differently than AeroShield. And so I do think that that's one of the things that has been really helpful in understanding where should we start to deliver this solution. And once we have it in the market, how do we grow it from there? But I think that there's also just this like engineering brain appreciation for it's not just about this technology. It's about looking at each one of the barriers or motivators for each one of those stakeholders and trying to say my greatest odds are for success if I can make sure every one of those stakeholders loves and wants my technology because I'm solving a problem that they care about and that they want to have solved.
Yeah. Well, your example about, the shipping challenge over the Rockies is such a great example of something that if you were sitting at your desk or if you didn't go out and observe and really understand your customer's experience or your partner's experience in the value chain, you never would have thought to ask that. Like that never would have come up. And it's not something that, someone not from the industry would have been able to, they might not even have thought to tell you that, you know what I mean? You would really need to go out and observe that firsthand yourself. So that's a great example of something I always say. If you're, as an entrepreneur, telling me something that I've never heard of before about the industry, that really tells me that like you've gone out there, you understand. So that's such a great indicator, even though it's not a check mark on the journey very clearly, it's such a good indicator that you've immersed yourself and you understand what motivates your customers or your partners and how they can be successful and what all the different incentives are that interact with each other. And I got to say, the Windows value chain is probably one of the more complicated ones out there because there are so many different materials and stakeholders in addition to the homeowner involved. So hats off to you for navigating that. It's really impressive.
Really appreciate that. And again, just want to call out that, there were a lot of resources, especially during my graduate degree. I think two things it would just highlight of one, if I were to show up and introduce myself to the people that have given me some of the best information about the market, if I show up and I go, I'm the CEO of AeroShield, you need my technology, and I'm here to tell you why you need it. That instead coming as the PhD student, which is a lot of times where I'd start from, and saying, I just really want to understand how you do things today. Where are your biggest problems? What do you wish more people that aren't in this market, that aren't in this space doing your job, what do you wish more people knew or change their behavior differently that would help us deliver better outcomes to everybody? That just even going in with that curiosity, it definitely yielded better results, but it also just was like so much more enjoyable to have that conversation with these experts. And I think it drew the right people to me and to AeroShield. Yeah.
Yeah, those are definitely the questions to ask. Like that is the perfect list of starter questions. If someone's struggling, those are the types of things. It gets people to talk about themselves or tell a story. And that is where you get the most rich information that is not just a checklist of yes, no questions. So I want to also recognize now, you're leading a team of 25, you've got a facility in Massachusetts, and you now have a new award from ARPA-E, 14.5 million, which is amazing. But, we're now in the present. We've been talking about several years of work, and I want to maybe give you a chance to talk about any stress tests you faced along the way. That's an exercise we run in our investment readiness program where it talks about all the unexpected things and the unpredictable things that maybe have nothing to do with what you were focusing on or could never have anticipated. Did anything like that come up for you in the last few years?
Yeah, I first I would just say that feels like most of my job is stress tests.
Yeah.
So at some point you start to look at those as like learning opportunities. So just want to call out that I think, having having VentureWell teach us how to do that early and do it in a place where it cost us a lot less to fail. Has been one of the things, because those kinds of stress tests just get bigger and more existential. It feels like as you do make progress towards proving or disproving whether this technology can change the world. One of the stress tests that I can talk about that it's still playing out is like customer partners and relationships. And I think one of the pieces when we were still even in the university, I think before I had really internalized this idea that I was going to be a founder and we were going to spin this technology out, and AeroShield was going to be the one to really get this technology into market. That I think that there was this idealism of, as we were talking with a lot of the big players in the industry and small players, we kept hearing really positive reinforcement for what we'd uncover. Still a lot of skepticism about the scaling. But, as I kind of mentioned in that story, coming in with that PhD, was just so impressed by how people said, "Oh, come out for a facility visit. We'll give you a little crash course. We'll introduce you to our company. We'll talk about what we do. We'll talk about our innovation group. We'll give you a tour of how we make glass and coated glass and insulated glass units, and we'll show you where we test them, and we'll test a small sample for you for free if you want." And it was like, oh yes, we're going to be a part of this big group that wants to solve this problem, and this technology is going to get out there, and I'll get to play this role that I'm very comfortable in now, which is this researcher who can help, kick off a tech to market transfer conversation. But, I've never scaled a company. I've never, started a company or built a manufacturing pilot. So that's going to be one of these big market players who's going to really take this technology and get it into the world. And I think in a really positive way, the more people that we talk to in the industry, we forged individual relationships with individual people in roles within these big companies. And they were incredibly positive and supportive. And then as AeroShield started to do better and better as a company, and we started to get closer to product and market, and something that, you could look at as with these potential customer partners as being something where we could work together, or there's some part of this that AeroShield from an innovation standpoint can do best. And there's some, part of this that the mass market scaling and having facilities and supply chain relationships that they could do best. But these individual people that we were talking with in these big companies are still part of this big company. And the way earlier that I was talking about, AeroShield is based on a technology, but the technology alone can't solve the problem. These big companies are set up the same way, and they have, different competing priorities. And AeroShield is, especially at the time that we were talking with some of these big companies, a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that happened was, it came down to, we were a finalist for a grant application, actually one of the early scale-up grants. We applied 3 times before we won that ARPA-E $14.5 million.
Wow,
so just
way to
say,
stick with it. Yeah.
We started to learn to use those grant applications as a great way to also do some internal planning. So it started to be like, we're not even going to guarantee that we're going to win this, but we're going to put our best application because we'll follow that plan whether we win this grant or not.
That's great.
But what ended up happening is in the second iteration, so about 2 or 3 years ago, we got to one of the requirements for the grant is having customer partners and having them help, with cost share. We got into the finalists, and one of the last attestations before we advanced into the final presentations was just reaffirming with all those customer partners that they were on board.
Yeah.
And about 12 hours before one of those deadlines came, one of these big customer partners came back to us and said, the point of contact was like, we can't support this. It's coming from the top down that we're just at a place where this just doesn't fit within our priorities, and we can no longer support. And so they ended up pulling out. And that was a very interesting lesson in, those people and our understanding of that company. We had, we saw real things that were supported by data, but there was still this sort of unknown over the top where the company had to make a decision as a collection of people.
Yeah.
And there was no way we could have saw that coming. The interesting piece was we had been told to be a little bit, protect ourselves from big players for this very reason since 2019, back when, thinking about spinning out of the university. So we didn't put all of our relationship investment into one relationship. So we did have a small market player who, I want to say that it was like 12 hours before we had to submit to ARPA-E that we had these customer partners, that this big player dropped out. We called up this small market, smaller market player, but still a leader in their area. And we didn't get a hold of them until the morning before, about 4 hours before the deadline. They put together the letter of support. They replaced that other customer partner. And since then, that relationship has continued to build. And now this is our public customer partner, ODL Windows and Doors. It's been phenomenal. They were a core partner when we won this $14.5 million in the third round around that we applied for it. They were a partner with us. And I shared that example because that has now happened to us in, larger and smaller. That was probably the most devastating because it was a little bit of ripping the Band-Aid of the first time experiencing that, dancing with an elephant and getting stepped on is a little bit of the way I think about it. But there are small examples of that happening throughout all of AeroShield, of understanding that even an investor, even somebody who is working directly with us as a point of contact isn't the only person who makes that decision. And so understanding that, we always have to, we trust people at their word, but we also understand that there are other dynamics around, which is why we then have, we look at risks, like what if our biggest customer partner has to stop engaging with us for whatever reason? What do we do then? And so now that's an intentional part of, looking at the different risks and talking about, okay, how would we know if this risk is being realized? And if it is, what can we have ready to help us, react quickly?
Yeah. And you can never prevent those types of situations, but all you can do is be prepared and have some contingency plans and maintain really strong relationships, which it sounds like you have done really well. You never want to, burn a bridge. You want to make sure that you're being transparent with your partners to the degree that you can, and just expect and understand that there are other factors at play. It's not that person, that point of contact, had anything against you. It sounds like they were up in a tough situation where the company maybe didn't have the resources anymore. So it's never, usually not going to be bad intentions, but it's good for you to, take that for what it is and then have the backup plan and just, sort of continue to be nice and have those relationships be in good standing so you can pivot if needed.
Yeah. And I would just call out that, that entity that, about 3 years ago, we went through this with, I think we still have a pretty healthy relationship with them. We don't engage, and, it's a lot more, we have a lot more protections about the way that we engage with them now, but, and especially that point of contact, like, still have a really great relationship, and we know that he's still a supporter. Yeah, you both still exist in the industry, right? So, that's still, even if something goes wrong, you don't want to cut somebody off entirely in an industry like this, right? It's good to stay, polite and civil and friendly. So. Yeah. And I think, that everybody always says don't take it personally. But I think hard not to, though. It is hard not to. And I think now knowing that, I will say that it was not a happy night before we got ODL to come in and replace that partnership. Definitely took that moment to go home, sit in my room, have a good cry, have a frustrated rant. But then also realizing that anger, that frustration, it's not directed at the company, it's not directed at any person, but it is directed into like, ooh, I'm going to do my best not to have that same outcome again. I'm going to be prepared for that next time. And that actually might be something that, I also look at it now going, the things that big company was worried about in risks, we've tackled a lot of them really efficiently. And I sometimes wonder if they have internal conversations of, ooh, should we have made that move, that I hope that there's a little regret in there. But then also looking at, but AeroShield also could now, if we did it again, do a better job of making it really clear that you're going to miss out on a world-changing opportunity if you don't stick with us. So I think that there also is like acknowledging that if that frustration is focused on the system, and again, looking at, there are barriers to why, the technology that AeroShield is bringing to market hasn't been done before. And starting to just go, oh, that's part of the value proposition, is helping this big company, understand why it's important to invest in this kind of innovation. we could have made that point of contact's job
Yeah.
maybe a lot easier if we went through that
Sure.
same process
Yeah.
again.
When you have a champion, it's your job to help that champion be the best champion they can be. Give them all the information to understand and advocate for you internally. Yeah, it sounds like you really learned from that experience and have taken that with you. And want to acknowledge that was a hard day for you, and you've been through a lot in the last almost 10 years. So what's something you do to take care of yourself in all of this?
Yeah, I would say, a big piece, and it waxes and wanes in terms of like how much time I have in my schedule. But I'm a maker, like a hobby person. So making small decorative elements for my home and family and friends, making things like jewelry. And some of those have gotten a little bit more amplified. Like after going through mechanical engineering, learned how to use power tools and different adhesives and materials properties. So there's a lot of really interesting exploration that I don't get that opportunity as much in my day to day. But what's really interesting is that, getting the more that I get away from work or have that opportunity to, kind of, I use the word dissolve into a fun task or into something creative like that. It not only helps me, I think, unpacked, definitely stay grounded, but it's also like I'm always surprised at how I'll be working on a craft project, and then some great insight about a better way to do things at AeroShield will just sort of pop up. So it's almost like I've found that in grad school, I think there was a lot of pressure of like, if I just do more, if I just study the aerogel more, that will be the difference. And now I'm starting to realize that taking care of yourself and connecting with other parts of your brain and physically, like your body. For me, there's also some physical elements to the crafting that just get you out of the sitting at a desk looking at a screen. Those have all been, I think, really helpful, but always looking for more things that help manage the stress. It's I think it's just a continual game of like always talking to other people and asking what they're doing. So I appreciate getting the chance to share with others in case that's something they want to try.
Yeah. It sounds like you get into a bit of a flow state. And if you just let your mind kind of meditate and go where it wants to go, you can solve some problems and think of some solutions for your day-to-day work. Yeah. Well, thank you, Elise. It was always great to watch your journey. I've known you for a long time now, and I'm so impressed with where you've ended up. I'm so proud of where you've ended up, and I hope you're proud of yourself too. And your team has been really great to work with, and I wish you nothing but the best. And I'm looking forward to having some aerogel transparent gels in my window someday. So thank you so much, Elise. It's great to work with you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, and would just call out again that things like the VentureWell and the Aspire program were so important early on, and again still reference a lot of those documents even now, share them with my team. So I think in a lot of ways also want to say thank you for continuing to make those programs available, especially to the kinds of people that really need them. Definitely was one of the things that helped convince me that tackling this challenge and learning from it and being able to share with other people who wanna give this career path a try. I think we both get to take some credit and some pride in for where AeroShield is at today. So really appreciate the opportunity.
That's really kind of you to say. Thanks, Elise.